I'm joining you from Calgary, and I am grateful to be introducing this session from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley, and Métis Nation Region 3 in Southern Alberta. Today's session, entitled Putting the Relations Back into Public Relations, Communication Ethics in an Era of Misinformation, will be presented by Dr. Jagris Hodson. Dr. Hodson is the Canada Research Chair in Digital Communication for the Public Interest. Her SSHRC and CIHR-funded research examines the ways that misinformation can be mitigated through digital communication efforts, particularly those targeted at the research community. Dr. Hodson's presentation and this session will be 45 minutes in length, and we hope to have time for questions at the end. I will be gathering questions posted on chat throughout the discussion. At the end, time permitting, I will pose your questions to Dr. Hodson. Thank you again for attending this session. Now, please welcome Dr. Hodson.
So you might be asking, right, like we're at a communication ethics conference. What does ethics have to do with misinformation? So, I'm going to start with a little story about my previous life working in public relations. So I actually did work as a professional communicator, and that makes it story time. When I worked in PR, I once had a very candid conversation with my boss about some work that we were doing at the time. We were working for a company that produced machines that killed people. So, basically weapons for the purposes of war. And I was an avowed pacifist. So luckily, my boss did not have me work on this account. She was really good at assigning accounts to different people who would be very good at doing them. But I asked her, I said, I know that you share the same values as me. How do you make sense of this? Why do you want to work for this client? I mean, sure, the money's good, but it doesn't seem to gel with the values that I thought we shared. It turns out we did indeed share the same values, but of course, my boss had some other values, which she informed me of and which are, I think, central to the ethics of professional communication. It made her so effective as a PR business person. And these are the values of relativism and individualism, which is part of an ethics of liberalism. So she said something that stuck with me. That is, our clients, even the ones that we take issue with personally, have their own side of the story. And I think most of you as professional communicators would agree with me. She said, sure, this company produces weapons, things that kill people, but they also put food on the table of many people employed to make, these killing machines. So she said, who are we as professionals to value one story, the story that we shouldn't kill people, over another, which is the story that this company creates jobs. So we're going to start with that. And this is an existing sort of liberal ethics of, the freedom of information and, this idea that everybody has their rights as an individual to do what they want to do. And it's not necessarily a bad ethics, but I'm going to challenge it a little bit today. So of course, this is a common refrain in the field of professional communication. At essence, it's the idea that everyone has a story that's worth telling, and communication professionals in marketing and PR and other areas have to do their best job at telling each individual's story. In turn, it's up to other individuals, so the clients, buyer beware, to consume multiple stories using venues like PR, marketing, other means, doing their research, etc., and making up their own minds. So again, you will be familiar with some expressions like sunlight disinfects. Let's get all the information we can out there, putting it into the world through our marketing or PR practice. Even though sometimes when we're marketing or PR or doing the professional communication, we might be providing information that leaves out part of the story, might be a little incomplete, or some people might challenge us as being leading. And if we do that, well, it's up to the consumer to educate themselves and then make their own decisions. And this is, as I mentioned, a liberal ethics of professional communication practice that has worked in the past, although I would argue it was always built on some faulty assumptions about the ways that people make choices and understand the world. Despite my misgivings, though, even if we can argue that this was a really good ethics of professional communication in the past, it's no longer good enough because we live in an era that is characterized by misinformation. So in this talk, I'm going to show you how our current misinformation tsunami requires a rethinking of communication ethics and a moral philosophy of communication, particularly in the practice of professional communication. And particularly, I'll use some examples from marketing and PR today. And I will propose that rather than an ethics grounded in this liberal individualism, we need one grounded in a moral philosophy of something called contractualism, developed by T.J. Scanlon, which is concerned first and foremost with the social contract. So contractualism being concerned with the social contract. And what this does is, instead of situating the responsibility for dealing with misinformation at the seat of each individual, which is impossible now when we're surrounded by so much misinformation, we need to ask, what do we owe to each other? What do we owe, not just as members of a professional body of communicators, but as large contributors to a society that's falling apart as a result of misinformation? And I think the stakes couldn't be any higher. People are literally dying right now as a result of misinformation. For example, in violent clashes fueled by Facebook, or as a result of not taking precautions against COVID-19 and getting sick. So today I'll start by defining misinformation and illustrating the ways our current communication environment contributes to this growing and urgent problem. I'm going to give examples that show how marketing and PR have, through their practices, exacerbated misinformation in the past and currently. And finally, I'll show why business as usual for professional communicators, public relations, marketing practitioners, etc., and professional communication scholars is no longer an option. I'll explain why I think that professional communicators have an ethical imperative to address misinformation in their own practice. So I'm going to start with a little definition of misinformation. Misinformation, succinctly, can be defined as false or misleading information. It can be spread both intentionally as malinformation or disinformation, and also unintentionally. And when spread intentionally, it can be wielded for political or other types of gain. And this is a subtype of misinformation that we like to call information operations. Public relations and marketing can often toe the line between simply omitting information that may be undesirable and intentionally spreading leading information that could start to creep into that information operations territory if it is in service of, for example, government messaging propaganda in some countries, for example. So this means that PR and marketing can sometimes deliberately, but most often without meaning to, contribute to misinformation flows through misinformation operations or other forms of misinformation and malinformation. Well, what is the role of all of these new technologies that we use all the time, like the one we're on right now, right? This current communication environment. Of course, we know that misinformation isn't new. And there are sometimes slippery connections between misinformation, PR, and marketing, which aren't really new either. I mean, there's been ethical PR professionals who have tried to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But we all know stories of unethical, sort of gray area PR and marketing, which maybe doesn't do as good a job as that. But what is new is the speed and scale of misinformation and the threat that misinformation poses right now to people's lives, health, and the fabric of democracy. Well, another new thing with the new communication technologies is the ability of governments in one part of the world to interfere with information in other parts of the world in order to destabilize democracy. Part of the reason that misinformation is such a problem right now is because new communication technologies that are so ubiquitous, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it, have created an environment in which misinformation has spread and also create an environment in which information proliferates. We have an abundance, too much maybe, an overload of information. So not just misinformation, but anything contributed by individuals, people, malevolent actors, people who mean us wrong, benevolent actors, people who want to do good things, media, influencers, scholars, and of course, professional communicators have created what I call a tsunami of information. There's just so much stuff out there being produced all the time on these interactive technologies. And at the same time, social media platforms are but one force in many that have worked to shake the foundations of professional communication practice. And you all know, many of you work in the field, the changes that we have gone through even in the last 10 years. Now, these new technologies have created new threats to the business of journalism, as we know, and have also ushered in new norms via engagement algorithms that have changed the way that we have to communicate information in order to even have it heard by others. And the resulting decline in agreed upon sources for accurate information and the resulting polarization of both media and individuals alike is a result both of the rise of what I'm calling the engagement economy and also this popularity of participatory media. In the engagement economy, the currency is likes, clicks, and shares. And the only rule is that attention begets attention. In other words, engagement algorithms on social media platforms prioritize content that seems to be popular, putting it in front of more people and then driving its popularity further. Unfortunately, often content that gets attention is highly dramatic and emotional in nature. It fills us with fear, dread, or anger. It's polarizing or divisive. Sometimes it's cute and cuddly, and often it provides easy but inaccurate answers to complex problems. An information economy that is driven by engagement in this way actually flies in the face of John Stuart Mill's marketplace of ideas, right? If you recall the marketplace of ideas, it's in essence the theory that, all things being equal, good ideas will win out over bad ones if both are given space. It's a theory that supports liberal ideas of free speech, but an engagement economy does not permit a functioning marketplace of ideas because an engagement economy does not give good and bad ideas equal weight. You're like, what? Well, this engagement economy should, like, right? I can just post something and it goes, right? No, but it does not give good and bad ideas equal weight in practice. Because in practice, we see an engagement economy prioritizing bad ideas that have a high emotional valence. So something that makes you really scared, but is not maybe an actually accurate idea. Or the engagement economy will prioritize bad ideas that offer simple answers to complex problems. And we see that a lot too. So this would be a problem even with a functioning fourth estate. However, traditional journalism has been deeply impacted by the engagement economy as well, to the point where it can no longer serve as a reliable source of information itself. So as a result of both social media and media deregulation generally, we're seeing a steep decline in local news outlets. We're also seeing the concentration of news into fewer and fewer corporate hands, and we're seeing the creation of news deserts. That is, places that are completely underserved with the news they need. In addition, certain beats that used to have dedicated journalists, like local news, regional politics, as well as the science beat, they no longer have specialized journalists with dedicated time to both develop an expert understanding of the issues and then report on them effectively. Compounding the problem, journalism schools are graduating talented journalism students who can no longer get good jobs in their field. Right? These jobs are few and far between. So some of these young people work as freelancers, but then there's pressure to conform to whatever the corporate needs of the people that will hire them. Others, because they're so talented communication, writing, they get jobs as like lobbyists or PR professionals. And then that's where you get steady employment. This creates what I've termed an imbalance between journalism and PR, where journalism used to have some power to fact check and push back on claims coming from PR. But now PR has a greater influence because often journalists are required or just under such a time crunch that they end up having to post press releases almost verbatim. And this is not anybody's fault. This is just an effect of an overstrained system. We see this acutely in Canadian news media, which was revealed by a recent Ricochet investigation. So Ricochet conducted an intensive 6-week study of key political shows across multiple networks in Canada. And they also completed a review of lobbyist findings. And they revealed there was a significant bias in Canadian television news shows. Lobbyists for banks, oil companies, arms manufacturers, and other corporate interests routinely appear on news shows, but they are not identified as being lobbyists. Ricochet's review of Canadian television news commentary occurred from about March 29th to May 9th and cataloged data on 860 relevant television appearances. More than 1 in every 10 guests analyzing the news worked for firms paid to influence the government. And despite their vested interest, networks didn't, describe them as being paid for that way. They were just considered under the generic term strategists. And corporate influencers were more often present in big discussions of certain issues. So 1 in every 5 guests brought on to comment on climate change was actually a corporate lobbyist. 1 in every 5 guests analyzing the federal budget was a corporate lobbyist, and a staggering 1 in every 3 guests were active in the PR industry. Now, it's not just lobbying that's the problem. As I mentioned before, there's some gray areas of PR that I'm sure nobody here is involved with, but we all know about, right? Public relations sometimes involves the practice of astroturfing, which, as you know, is fake grassroots sites. One of these examples is the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation. So this is described as an initiative that helps equip Canadian businesses and organizations with insights, tools, and support as they work to redefine and strengthen the scope of their purpose and the contributions they make more broadly to society. But it's actually a creation of Navigator PR, which is a well-known PR firm that is notorious for using tactics that really are just, on that line. Is it ethical? Is it not ethical? And the problem with these types of PR practices is they actually erode trust in the public. And there's a relationship between a lack of trust and the spread of misinformation. Additionally, the lack of news in certain fields, science, health, examples, leads people to look for answers online in dubious places, right? People make up for their lack of local news by turning to their friends and influencers on social media. And in fact, we can see from Pew Research that young people are more likely to report getting their political news from YouTube. And that's not always an unbiased source, right? Influencers that report on politics or even scientific studies via podcasts or social media are as likely to peddle in opinion as they are in fact. But consumers don't always recognize this or even care. And we can see these problems too, the problems of engagement in the field of marketing, right? Marketers found out a century ago that simply providing people with information on a product is not really a good way to sell it. But if you can arouse an emotion, right, or an aspiration in somebody, that's how you sell something. So marketers use many of the same tactics as other professional communicators, including like ad buying on social media, targeting on Facebook, and often use psychometric tactics, right? So providing incomplete or misleading information, using emotions, image, and identity to market questionable products, like, think about cigarette marketing in the 90s, or oil companies maybe, using images of pristine wilderness to market their company. Marketers also often use data extraction and manipulation, so scraping stuff from social media in order to complete a psychological profile of the people they're marketing to so they can more effectively market. Well, one might argue that these are part of professional practice and that we are actually achieving our goals for our clients by using a full range of approaches, including psychometrics, emotion, and those sorts of things. I argue that in an age of misinformation, we can no longer use these approaches ethically if indeed we ever could. And while maybe we won't get rid of every tactic that I've described here, for example, we might still want to use emotion to craft a message. I mean, it would be silly not to, right? Many tactics do need to be rethought, though, in an age of misinformation. Specifically, I will say, the ones that most reasonable people might object to. So, what were those? Well, here are two comments I get a lot from people who work in social media marketing. First of all, people tell me, I would rather be delivered advertisements that are targeted to me than random ads. And secondly, people tell me, well, that people can stop using social media whenever they want. So it's not my responsibility to change what I'm doing if it's effective. Now, I say that these aren't really great arguments. It's sort of like passing the buck and idealist thinking about the way the world works. And they're not actually grounded in a deep communication ethics. And they are even less ethical when misinformation is a threat to democracy. Most Canadians, for example, indicate when they are asked in a poll that they do not wish their social media data to be used without consent for marketing purposes. So people don't want it. They tell us they don't want their data used in this way. And also, most of us do not have the bandwidth to read or adjust our behavior based on often opaque and hard to understand terms of services for platforms. So it's hard to know that whether we are using something where people can freely scrape our data or whether we have more rights there. Furthermore, it's not just so easy for everybody to get off social media if they have an issue with data extraction. If most people are telling us they do not want their data extracted from social media for marketing purposes, how is doing so ethical? So, understanding that misinformation is deadly and that marketing and PR are playing an outsized role in the spread of misinformation, even if not on purpose, it becomes a matter of communication ethics that we rethink how these disciplines are practiced. So my question becomes, what does an ethical professional communication practice look like in an age of misinformation? We're not, strictly speaking, atomized individuals who can just function in the absence of a collective. If anything, the pandemic and the wildfire-like spread of misinformation about it has shown this. A libertarian individualist ethics is not, never was, but especially not now, sufficient to guide professional communicators. Now, marketers and PR professionals can actually be knights in this battle against misinformation. They're on the front lines and thus are well positioned to help fight it. In fact, looking at this problem from another angle, we might even argue that this age marks an important inflection point for professional communicators, particularly those in marketing and PR. We could either continue on with this individual ethics that isn't working and contribute to the decline of modern society via the spread of unchecked misinformation, or we can adopt a new professional ethics grounded in relationality, and remember the word from before, contractualism. So this brings me to my second question. What does an ethics born out of contractualism look like for professional communicators in an age of misinformation? So for T.J. Scanlon, the moral philosopher who developed contractualism, thinking about right and wrong means thinking about our relationships with each other on a broader scale, both our relationships with those directly in our community and also with not only distant others, but even others yet to come. So the idea that stakeholders include everyone who might be impacted by the spread of misinformation, including those down the road who, for example, might be victims of climate change related misinformation or political unrest, help us to understand the stakes of what we're discussing. So how do we make sense of professional communication while considering these distant and future others? Scanlon suggests that we frame our understanding of moral action in terms that could be justified to others and that they could not reasonably reject. Applying this to the ethics of professional communication, we need to frame the way we conduct our practice as professional communicators in ways that others, near to us, distant, and also future others, could not reasonably reject. So let's apply this via a bit of visioning exercise to marketing and PR, contrasting this approach with current practice. In the broadest of strokes, how do we practice now? Taking the client messaging and packaging it in the most effective possible way to get the desired outcomes for the client, right? That's basic. Why would people object? Well, sometimes the packaging makes the messaging a little bit misleading or leaves important information out, which can then lead to the inadvertent spread of misinformation or simply a lack of trust in the information provided to us, particularly when we apply our professional communication practice to government or science communication. So in contrast, an ethical practice grounded in contractualism, one which could be justified to people and which they could not reasonably object, would recognize that while our client might be served by selective messaging, in an age of misinformation, the general public is not, and may even be put at risk by our approach. So this expands the understanding of who we answer to as communication professionals beyond our paying clients. This approach would center public relations as relationships with the public, putting the relations back into public relations, and it would mean encouraging your clients to do the same. It means embracing an ecological and relational view of the world instead of a transactional and individualistic one. An ethical professional communication practice would involve listening to the people in our communities and the communities that are served by our communication. Why do we listen? And we kind of already listen, right? In PR, we currently listen to craft the right message. But if we think of ethical PR in ways that a reasonable person cannot object, we start to listen as part of being in a relationship with others. Now think of relationships in your life, your family, your friends, your loved ones. In these relationships, we ideally listen so that we can act in the best interest of the person we're in a relationship with. This means that if we take this into our PR practice or our professional communication practice, we want to listen to the public in order to act in their best interest, which in an age of misinformation could mean reconsidering whether the communication should happen at all. And if so, what does the public deserve to know? We're no longer to act as mouthpieces for client interests only, but as advocates for the public. An ethical professional communication practice means understanding that marketing and PR professionals have influence and are in a position to push back on misinformation, whether it's spread knowingly or unknowingly by our clients. In fact, in a time where misinformation literally kills, an ethical practice grounded in the moral philosophy of contractualism would suggest that marketing and PR professionals must push back on misinformation and even on partial information. We must encourage transparency, clarity, and communication that is always in the best interest of the publics being served by our clients. This could also mean, in some cases, firing clients that want us to engage in questionable practices, or not taking the job if clients want us to traffic in misinformation. An ethical professional communication practice means a new epistemology. It means rejecting relativity and embracing evidence, especially with respect to government, science communication, and journalism. Public relations commonly takes the perspective of truth as relative, meaning we have a duty to report on the truth as our clients see it. But this relativistic view is damaging, and a reasonable person could understandably take objection to it. So instead, we need to adjust our practice so that our role is to also fact check what our clients tell us, particularly if the information is going out via a press release. This means doing what's right rather than just doing what's popular. An ethical professional communication practice also means refraining from tactics you might feel pressure to use, but are ultimately deceptive or manipulative. What could a reasonable person object to? Gray areas in PR that are still unfortunately commonly practiced. For example, those psychometric tests popularized by Cambridge Analytica. They serve to use psychological and emotional tricks to manipulate people. Stuff like that needs to be rejected. We also need to say no to other gray area tactics like astroturfing, buying followers, or bot amplification. These methods are used because they're effective, but reasonable people can and have objected to them. An ethical professional communication practice may also mean rejecting practices that are commonly used, but considered by most people to be invasive or objectionable. Scraping social media data, people don't want us to do it. They've told us they don't want their activities on social media mined for marketing and PR purposes. It's up to us to adjust our practice accordingly. Okay, Jagris, but this is pie in the sky. Like, it's not realistic. I'll lose clients. Yeah, right now it feels like we'd lose clients. But this is why these approaches have to be acted on by the entire sector. This is why we need professional organizations and governing bodies to dictate the standards and practices for ethical PR and call out those who don't abide by them as black hat PR. This is why we need to call attention to those people who won't follow ethical practice. Additionally, I would like to challenge you and say that there's an opportunity here to lead in this fight against misinformation. As PR professionals, we are well positioned to frame our activity as the moral, just, ethical, and democratic action that it is. And we can show how this new standard of professional communication makes the world a better place. And that, I think it goes without saying, is great PR for the communication industry. But more, just as a human being who cares about society not unraveling, I would ask why we wouldn't each want to do this anyway as a matter of course. And if we all do it, then our clients will have limited other options. Of course, one could argue that from a moral philosophy standpoint, like contractualism, if misinformation is so damaging, and I would say it is, ethically, everyone has a role to play in mitigating it. And while I think that marketing and PR professionals sort of lead and have this added responsibility due to their jobs, I would argue that a problem such as misinformation requires us all to engage in personal as well as professional communication ethics. So what does an ethics of communication look like for different stakeholders in an age of misinformation? I'll outline this for the general public, social media platforms, governments, scholars, and other professional communication.
Dr. Hodson, I just want to let you know that there are 15 minutes remaining in your session.
Fantastic, I'm almost done. So for the general public, ethical communication means embracing and funding new opportunities for journalism so we can build back the fourth estate. It means differentiating between evidence and opinion in your own communication practice. It means being careful what we share. And it means stopping sharing on social media and cutting back on social media use, particularly when you're feeling those strong emotions driving your social media use. For social media platforms and the people who work with them, ethical communication means understanding that current algorithms are actually morally repugnant, and prioritizing an algorithm of the public good would be better rather than prioritizing one of engagement. It means curtailing growth when it occurs on the backs of civil unrest or misinformation flows. It means adopting an ethics of professional practice similar to journalistic ethics about what you are amplifying. And it means thinking about misinformation in the same way we think about companies that poison the air or the water. This is toxic and it needs to be cleaned up. What can governments do? So for governments and government communicators, ethical communication means regulating misinformation like we regulate environmental toxins. It means capping the growth of social media companies through antitrust mechanisms. In government communication specifically, it means grounding decisions in evidence always, or explaining why evidence was not used in that case. And it means listening and responding appropriately to the public, talking with rather than at them, and stop feeling the need to broadcast only this well-crafted message to the public. And now for scholars, and this is close to my heart, ethical communication means communicating your research first in ways that are scrutable for the public. It means critiquing traditional knowledge gatekeeping mechanism like expensive journals and committing to making your scholarship available to the public. And it means engaging with the public in new ways and recognizing colleagues who do so, like this conference. It means a commitment to understand misinformation as an ethical problem rather than just a practical or algorithmic one. So for other professional communicators, ethical communication means finding new opportunities to communicate science and make it clear and accessible. It means holding oneself to exacting standards of evidence, being transparent about sources and guests, especially in journalism, and reconsidering what we will accept from PR firms as a professional communication in journalism. Misinformation is a major problem, but professional communicators are uniquely skilled and able to address this problem. Given that we have the ability to make a difference here, there should be no question of whether we will change our practice to make this difference. So today, I hope I've shown you why the ethics of professional communication needs to move on from one grounded in liberalism to one grounded in contractualism. This is not a nice to have. In fact, for many, this shift could be a life or death decision. So the time to shift our practices as professional communicators is now, and we need to turn our back, or not turn our back on these issues. In his description of contractualism, T.J. Scanlon always comes back to the question of, what do we owe to each other? What do we owe to each other as professional communicators? First and foremost, we owe the public our promise to do everything in our power, including challenging common practices and taken for granted professional assumptions to stop misinformation in its tracks. If we do not do so, we risk democracy, community cohesion, and for some, life itself. This problem is urgent and important, and I can think of no better goal for professional communicators than developing a practice that stops the harms of misinformation. This is how we leave our mark on the world. Thank you so much. And I'm open for questions if anybody has them. And you can also see my, my contact information at the bottom of the slide. First is a Twitter handle, and then also my Royal Roads email if you have any additional questions.
I do have some questions that I've compiled here that have come in, Dr. Hodson. So one question that's come in from quite a few is that the session is recorded, but there's great interest in a transcript or an article based on this talk. There's a lot of people thinking there's a lot here, and so there's interest in that. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I do have my notes. So I would be happy to send those out. And I have published briefly on this, the beginnings of what became this talk in the conversation. So I can also include a link to the conversation article.
Okay, excellent. Megan Fitzgibbon had asked partway through, about halfway through your talk, did the study, you were referring to a study, did it look at both English language and French language media interviews? So she wanted to know if it was looking at both.
Oh, the Ricochet study. I believe it was in both languages, and I would have to go and look that up further to confirm. But yeah, it was quite comprehensive.
Okay, I've got a question here from Kara McGregor. I wonder how misinformation impacts our ability to achieve Grunig's two-way communication model. If we can't agree on a common set of facts, how can we enter into a dialogue with our audiences, which is supposed to shape our communications approach?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one, right? Because you have to start with some idea of shared reality of what the facts are, and we're really struggling with that right now. But that's why I think that part of the solution is a more ethical and transparent PR practice, because part of the reason why people don't trust what they see coming from governments and government media, for example, or even what they see from, you know, quote unquote, people, mainstream media that people love to hate, is because for quite some time now, we've had not misleading, but sometimes incomplete information and non-transparent, right? Which arises out of the practice of PR. And so if we can begin to show people that's not how we're practicing anymore, I think we have more of a chance at redeveloping a shared reality.
Okay, I have a question here from Jules Andre Brown. They wanted to know if you could talk about the relativistic challenges in some of the recent issues we are facing these days. Do you have any comments on how could contractualism look like in topics where people are nervous to stand up, such as police brutality, or at occupations such as in the nation's capital?
Well, I mean, we're not practicing a contractualism with respect to communicating on those issues right now, right, Jules? So I would say it's difficult to what if these issues. But when I think of, for example, climate change, which is another contentious issue, right? Again, I think we have to consider, okay, near others. So what do people like us think is reasonable? But then you have to take a step away and say distant others. What do people not like me, think is reasonable? What can we come to an agreement on? The majority, again, because you're not going to reach everybody all the time, but what will most people think is reasonable that I do here? And then you have to project forward, right, into the future. Children, that will grow up, or maybe people who aren't born yet, what will they think it's reasonable that I do right now? And by adopting that, for example, if you think about climate change, well, I mean, I think the children in the future would want me to do everything I can to share the science of climate change. And a reasonable person hopefully could not object to something that is grounded in actual scientific thought rather than science PR, right? Which again, something is different. So then we have to figure out how to be more transparent in the process and how to reach people with a message of science that they can hear and that doesn't sound jargony and that doesn't sound like you're talking down to them, right? So there's a lot of moving parts here and it's complex, but I think what contractualism allows us to do is reconsider who our stakeholders are in a way that's really positive for professional communication. Oh, Marianne, I think you're muted.
Sorry, lots of questions coming in. I have one from Duarte. I'm sorry if I said this wrong. Duarte de Silva. Will it take the unprecedented mobilization of the communications industry to fight the prevalence of disinformation and misinformation tangibly instead of leaving the fight to media organizations who are busy maintaining the integrity of its newsrooms?
Yes, I love that, right? So that's why I put together this talk today for a group I know who's quite a well-educated, very highly professional, everything else. Yes, I think we each need, right, to fight it on our own fronts. So if you're a scholar, you need to start asking yourself, how can I make this information clearer and more available to the public, right? If you're working in journalism, how can I build my journalism from evidence and resist the temptation to just bring lobbyists on my program or those sorts of things, right? If you are a PR professional, well, what does it mean to think of the different stakeholders other than my clients in this, and how do I push back? And yes, I think the only way that we can fight this is by fighting it on all kinds of fronts. And as professional communicators, we are uniquely positioned to be able to deal with this problem in a way that, say, even the most well-meaning doctors who communicate about their health issues, they can't do it the way we can. And we can then work with people. We can work with scientists. We can work with doctors. We can work, with people, in government who we feel are doing the right thing to then communicate that to the public. But we have the skills to really address misinformation and disinformation. And you can see globally, geopolitically, the time is now, because we are being manipulated by malevolent actors here at home and around the world.
Excellent. Here's another one. This is from Marie. Was there a specific Scanlon work or paper that helped shape your thoughts?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's an entire book, though, and it's really dense, but I recommend it because it's a beautiful way to think of not just communication, but other big moral decisions we make in life. The book is called What We Owe to Each Other, which is, I talked about it in my talk. Also, the title of his book, I highly recommend it. And I highly recommend we all think about contractualism as a moral philosophy that maybe makes sense in professional practice and also as a way to live.
There's some comments on here as well, not pure questions, but people are sharing information. Andy Watson said, for interest, the Edelman Trust Barometer is a source that discusses the data behind mistrust. So do you have anything to add about that?
Oh, that was what I used when I was putting the numbers together for this talk and talking about trust. And yes, I used the Edelman Trust Barometer. So thank you for bringing that up.
Comment here from Anne. And Peridot. For stakeholder engagement and analysis, I include future generations and the environment. Those two are voiceless, but their needs and interests must be considered.
Yes, yeah, and I completely agree.
Going through, you guys can, we've got a couple more minutes if there's more questions coming in. In the meantime, El Nadine Delisle said, there are two parts to governments, the political arm with comms peeps, press secretaries who deal with policy and political side, and then the civil service side with comms peeps, who are more objective and non-biased. The civil servant comms peeps do push back, but there should be clear boundaries between the two. And from her experience, there's sometimes a blur. Could you speak a little bit more about those boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I've worked with government too, and I love my colleagues in the civil service. I love them. And I've been in meetings, right, where I was told, well, we can't, talk about, the full science that guided our decision because we want to go out with this messaging, this positive messaging or what have you. And I've also been trained by top civil servants to say, well, as a scholar coming in and advising government, your job is to give advice and then get out of the way and then support whatever your minister decides to do, even if that goes against, right, like the scientific advice that I might have provided as evidence to advise for a certain position. If the minister decides to go with a different position because of, maybe their constituents or whatever other concerns they're bringing to the table, then I can't right now, if I'm a government scientist, stand up and say, actually, I don't agree with that. The evidence is not there. And while I understand that this might have worked in the past, I think that now it's not working and it's breeding more distrust. So I think we need to give our government scientists and our government communication people a little more freedom to be transparent. And then if the minister needs to say, I couldn't go with the science on this case because X, Y, and Z, that could be valid, but we need to hear why. And we also need to hear that, well, yeah, this was the advice provided by all of these different stakeholders, including scientists who need to be able to say, yeah, the science says X.
Excellent, thank you. And in all the comments, Amber Bosma Roque would like to know what courses are you teaching at Royal Roads?
Oh, amazing.
so that everyone knows.
There's actually going to be a course on misinformation in society. It will be, I think, an elective available to you, and I think it's running in May. So that's the next one I'm teaching. So if it fits into your schedules, I would love to see any of you in it who are interested, and we'll be talking more in depth about all of these issues.
Okay, and that basically brings us now to the end of our talk. We're right on the button here. So I want to thank you, Dr. Hodson, for your presentation. And I really want to thank everyone who attended this session and for these great questions. So we'll be now moving into a short 15-minute break. And then after that, the next session starts at 12 noon. And it's a panel discussion entitled Sport, Leadership, and Social Change, Episode 13, Inclusivity, Equity, and Diversity in Sport. So thank you, everyone, for a great session. And thank you, Dr.
Thank you, everyone. This was fantastic. And enjoy the rest of your conference.